I was standing at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee when I saw 3 HOA board members and 2 contractors ripping out my entire vegetable garden. And for a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. My name is Marcus Caldwell, and I had lived in the Riverside Meadows subdivision in Gilbert, Arizona for 6 years. It was one of those planned communities that promised suburban paradise, with its manicured lawns, cookie-cutter houses in varying shades of beige and tan, and a homeowners association that supposedly existed to maintain property values. I had moved there after my divorce, thinking a fresh start in a quiet neighborhood would be exactly what I needed. For the first few years, everything had been fine. I paid my dues on time, kept my lawn green, and minded my own business. Then, about 8 months ago, I decided to plant a vegetable garden in my backyard. Nothing crazy, just a 20 by 15-foot plot where I grew tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, zucchini, lettuce, and some herbs. Gardening had become my therapy after the divorce. There was something incredibly satisfying about nurturing plants from seeds, watching them grow, and eventually harvesting food I could actually eat. My backyard was completely fenced, and the garden wasn't visible from the street. I had checked the HOA covenants before planting anything, and nowhere did it say vegetable gardens were prohibited. But apparently, Barbara Hendricks, the HOA president, had different ideas. I bolted out my back door, still in my pajama pants and t-shirt, my coffee sloshing onto the deck. "What the hell are you doing? That's my garden!" Barbara stood there with her arms crossed, wearing a cream-colored pantsuit despite it being 7 in the morning on a Saturday. She was in her mid-50s, with that particular haircut where the back is shorter than the front, dyed an unnatural shade of blonde. Her lips were pressed into a thin line that seemed to be her permanent expression. "Mr. Caldwell," she said in that condescending tone she had perfected, "we sent you multiple notices about this unsightly vegetable plot. Since you refused to comply, the board voted to have it removed and restore your yard to community standards." "Unsightly? It's in my backyard, and I never received any notices." She pulled out a folder from her oversized purse. "We have documentation showing 3 notices were sent to your address over the past 2 months. You had ample time to remedy the situation." I watched in horror as the contractors uprooted my tomato plants, which had been heavy with fruit just starting to ripen. Months of work was being destroyed in minutes. "You can't just come onto my property and tear up my garden. This is trespassing." "Actually," Barbara said, pulling out another document, Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the HOA covenants grants the board the right to enter any property to remedy violations after proper notice has been given and ignored." "I never got any notices," I repeated, my voice rising. "That's not our problem if you don't check your mail, Mr. Caldwell." The 2 contractors had already filled 3 large trash bags with my plants. One of them was digging up my raised beds with a shovel. The other HOA board members present were Deborah Martinez, the vice president, and Richard Paulson, the treasurer. They both avoided making eye contact with me, clearly uncomfortable but going along with Barbara's power trip. "I want you off my property right now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll be contacting my attorney." Barbara actually smiled. "You're welcome to do that. In the meantime, you'll be receiving a fine of $500 for the violation, plus you'll be billed for the removal and restoration costs, which will run approximately $1,500. My jaw dropped. $2,000 for a vegetable garden in my own backyard that nobody can even see? The covenants clearly state that all landscaping must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Vegetable gardens are considered agricultural use, which is prohibited in residential zones per our community standards. "That's insane. Half the neighborhood has vegetable gardens." "Actually, you're the only one." "Hey," Barbara said. "We maintain very high standards here at Riverside Meadows." I looked at Deborah and Richard. "You 2 are okay with this? This is how you want to treat your neighbors?" Deborah finally spoke up, her voice quiet. "The covenants are the covenants, Marcus. We all agreed to them when we bought our homes." "Show me where it says no vegetable gardens," I demanded. Barbara flipped through her folder. Section 8, Paragraph 2. All exterior modifications and landscaping changes must be submitted to and approved by the Architectural Review Committee prior to installation. Section 15, Paragraph 7. No agricultural, commercial, or industrial activities may be conducted on residential properties. A vegetable garden isn't agricultural activity. By that logic, nobody could have fruit trees or rose bushes. Ornamental plants are different from food production, Barbara stated flatly. The contractors finished loading up the last of my garden. The raised beds I had built by hand were broken apart and tossed in their truck. The soil I had spent months conditioning with compost was being scooped into bins. My backyard looked like a construction zone. "We'll be sending a landscaping crew next week to restore the grass," Barbara said. "You'll receive an itemized bill. The fine must be paid within 30 days or it will increase by $50 per month until paid in full, and we can place a lien on your property." They left, and I stood in my destroyed backyard, shaking with rage and disbelief. I'd never felt so violated. This was my home, my property that I paid a mortgage on, and these people had just marched in like they owned it. I went inside and immediately started searching for any mail from the HOA. I had kept every piece of correspondence in a file folder. The last thing I had received was a newsletter 2 months ago about the annual meeting. There were no notices about my garden. Nothing. I called my neighbor, Tom Harrison, who lived 3 houses down. Tom was a retired accountant in his late 60s who had lived in Riverside Meadows since the development was built 15 years ago. "Tom, did you ever get multiple notices from the HOA before they took action on something?" I asked. "Usually they're pretty good about sending letters," he said. "Why? What happened?" I explained the situation. There was a long pause. "Marcus, I hate to tell you this, but Barbara has been on a power trip for the last year since she became president. She fined the Johnsons $300 because their Christmas lights were up 2 days past the January 1st deadline. She reported the Chens to the city because their teenage son's car was parked on the street for 3 days, claiming it was an abandoned vehicle. Why hasn't anyone done anything about her? Most people just pay the fines and move on. It's easier than fighting. Plus, Barbara is buddies with a lawyer who does HOA law, so she always has legal backing for her decisions." After hanging up with Tom, I spent the rest of the morning researching Arizona HOA law. I learned that while HOAs did have broad powers, they also had to follow proper procedures. They had to provide actual notice, not just claim they sent it. They had to hold properly noticed board meetings, and the homeowners had the right to attend meetings and voice concerns. I also discovered that Arizona law allowed homeowners to petition for a recall election of board members. I would need signatures from 20% of the homeowners to trigger a recall vote. But first, I needed to document everything and find out if Barbara had actually sent those notices. On Monday morning, I took a personal day from my job as an IT manager at a healthcare company and went to the post office. I spoke with the postmaster and asked if there was any way to verify whether certified mail had been sent to my address from the HOA. "If it was sent certified or registered, we'd have a record," the postmaster, a friendly woman named Gloria, told me. "Let me check your address." She typed into her computer. "I'm showing nothing certified to your address from the HOA in the past 6 months. Can I get that in writing?" "Sure thing." She printed out a statement and stamped it with the official post office seal. Next, I went to a law office. I had found an attorney named Jennifer Walsh who specialized in HOA disputes. Her office was in a modest building in downtown Gilbert. Jennifer was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed and no nonsense. She listened to my story while taking notes. "Did you take pictures of the garden before they destroyed it?" she asked. "Yes, I have hundreds. I documented everything as it grew." "Good. And you have pictures of the destruction?" "I took video on my phone while they were doing it." "Even better. And the post office verified no certified mail was sent?" I handed her the stamped statement from Gloria. Jennifer leaned back in her chair. "Here's the situation. The HOA almost certainly violated proper procedure. Arizona law requires actual notice for enforcement actions, and they need to give you an opportunity to cure the violation before taking self-help measures. However, fighting this through the courts will be expensive and time-consuming." "How expensive?" "Could be $5,000 to $10,000 in legal fees, maybe more if it goes to trial. You might win, but it would take months or even over a year." My heart sank. "So Barbara just gets away with it?" "I didn't say that. There's another option. You said you want to recall the board?" "If I can." Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 33, 1813, allows for recall of board members with a petition signed by 20% of the members entitled to vote. How many homes are in your HOA? I think around 150. So you need 30 signatures. If you get them, the HOA has to hold a special meeting within 30 days for the recall vote. A simple majority of homeowners present can vote to recall. And then what? Then you'd need people willing to serve on the new board, people who won't abuse their power like Barbara has been doing. I left Jennifer's office with a plan. First, I would collect signatures for a recall petition. Then, I would find reasonable people to run for the board, and I would make sure that everyone in Riverside Meadows knew exactly what Barbara and her cronies had done. That evening, I created a simple flyer explaining what had happened, including pictures of my garden before and after. I printed out 150 copies at a local print shop. Then, I spent the next 3 evenings walking the neighborhood and putting a flyer in every mailbox. My phone started ringing the next day. "Marcus, this is Angela Voss from Maple Street. I got your flyer. I had no idea the HOA could do something like that." "Neither did I, Angela. I want to sign your recall petition. When can I do that?" Over the next week, I had similar conversations with dozens of neighbors. It turned out that Barbara had made a lot of enemies. The Johnsons, who had been fined over Christmas lights, eagerly signed. The Chens signed. A couple named the Hendersons had been fined because their house numbers weren't exactly centered on their house according to Barbara's measurements. They signed. A woman named Patricia Garrett, who lived 2 streets over, came to my door one evening. She was probably in her early 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes. "Marcus, I want to help," she said. "I've lived here for 12 years, and I've watched this HOA become more and more unreasonable. Barbara is the worst president we've ever had. I'll not only sign your petition, but I'll help you collect signatures." With Patricia's help, we had 40 signatures within 10 days. That was more than the required 30, giving us a cushion in case anyone's eligibility was challenged. I prepared the official recall petition according to the format required by Arizona law, attached all the signatures, and hand-delivered it to Barbara's house on a Saturday morning. She answered the door in yoga pants and a tight athletic top, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. When she saw me, her expression immediately soured. "Mr. Caldwell, what do you want?" I handed her the thick envelope. "This is an official petition for recall of the HOA Board of Directors, submitted pursuant to Arizona Revised Statutes Section 33-1813. You are required to hold a special meeting within 30 days. She opened the envelope and flipped through the pages, her face getting redder with each page. "You can't be serious." "Completely serious. You violated my rights, destroyed my property, and didn't follow proper procedures. The homeowners deserve better leadership. These signatures aren't valid. You coerced people. Every signature is voluntary and was given after I explained what happened. But feel free to challenge them if you want. I have affidavits from multiple signers if needed." Barbara's hands were shaking slightly, which gave me a small sense of satisfaction. "You're making a huge mistake. The board has the full support of our attorney." "Then I guess we'll see what the homeowners think. You have 30 days to schedule the meeting. If you don't, I can petition the court to compel it, and you'll be responsible for my legal fees." I walked away, leaving her standing in her doorway clutching the petition. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was Richard Paulson, the HOA treasurer. "Marcus, can we talk? Off the record?" "Sure. I want you to know that I wasn't comfortable with what Barbara did to your garden. She pushed it through without really discussing it properly at a board meeting. Deborah and I kind of got steamrolled." "Then why did you let it happen?" "Because fighting Barbara is exhausting. She dominates every meeting, makes unilateral decisions, and if you disagree with her, she makes your life miserable. But I think you're right to call for this recall. She's gone too far. Will you support the recall?" There was a pause. "I can't publicly go against her, but I won't fight it either. And I'll vote for reasonable people if they run for the board." "Fair enough. Marcus, there's something else you should know. Barbara didn't send you any notices. She had me print them out on HOA letterhead, but she never mailed them. She put them in the file and dated them like they were sent, but they weren't." My grip tightened on the phone. "Are you willing to testify to that?" Another long pause. If it comes to that, yes. I'm tired of being part of this. Thank you, Richard. After that call, I contacted Jennifer Walsh again and relayed what Richard had told me. That's fraud, Jennifer said. Creating false documentation to justify their actions. That could potentially be criminal, not just a civil matter. Should I go to the police? Let's see how the recall plays out first. If they pay you back for the damages and step down, that might be the cleanest resolution. But keep that information as leverage. The HOA posted notice of the special recall meeting, scheduled for exactly 28 days after I submitted the petition. It would be held at the community center at 7 in the evening. In the meantime, I needed to find people willing to serve on a new board. Patricia Garrett agreed to run for president. Tom Harrison agreed to run for treasurer. A younger guy named Miguel Foster, who was an engineer and had lived in the neighborhood for 4 years, agreed to run for secretary. We needed 2 more people for a 5-person board. Angela Voss, who had been one of the first to sign the petition, agreed to run for vice president. She was a high school teacher, sharp and organized. The 5th position was filled by Robert Nash, a firefighter who lived on the other side of the development. He was soft-spoken, but had a reputation for being fair and reasonable. I created new flyers introducing the candidates and explaining their platform. Transparent governance, reasonable enforcement of rules, proper procedures, and respect for homeowners' rights. Patricia, Tom, Angela, Miguel, Robert, and I walked the neighborhood again, knocking on doors and talking to people. The response was overwhelmingly positive. It seemed that Barbara had alienated far more people than I realized. A man named David Kowalski told me that Barbara had fined him $200 because his trash cans were visible from the street on a day that wasn't trash day, even though he had just brought them in from the curb and they had been out for less than an hour. A woman named Susan Ramirez said Barbara had tried to fine her for having a wreath on her door in July, claiming seasonal decorations were only allowed during the actual season. As the meeting date approached, Barbara went on the offensive. She sent out a letter to all homeowners claiming that the recall was being orchestrated by someone who wanted to turn Riverside Meadows into a rundown neighborhood with no standards. She claimed my vegetable garden had been overgrown and full of weeds, attracting rodents. She included grainy, zoomed-in photos that supposedly showed my backyard but had clearly been manipulated to look worse than reality. I countered by posting clear, high-resolution photos on a community Facebook group someone had created. The contrast was obvious. My garden had been neat, well-maintained, and attractive. Barbara's photos were deceptive at best. The night of the special meeting arrived. I got there 30 minutes early. The community center was a medium-sized building with a main room that could hold maybe 200 people in chairs. Patricia, Tom, Angela, Miguel, and Robert were already there, looking nervous but determined. "Ready for this?" Patricia asked me. "As ready as I'll ever be." Homeowners started arriving, and kept arriving. By 7 o'clock, the room was packed. I estimated at least 120 people were there, which was remarkable for an HOA meeting. Normal monthly meetings typically drew maybe 10 to 15 people. Barbara sat at a table at the front of the room with Deborah and Richard flanking her. She looked composed, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. At 7 sharp, Barbara called the meeting to order. She went through the standard opening procedures, then addressed the recall petition. "We're here tonight because Mr. Marcus Caldwell has submitted a petition to recall the board of directors. Before we proceed to any vote, I want to address the false and inflammatory claims that have been circulated." She launched into a prepared speech about how the board had acted properly, how I had violated the covenants, how they had followed all required procedures, and how the recall was simply an attempt by someone who didn't want to follow the rules. When she finished, Patricia raised her hand. "Madam President, the petitioner should have an opportunity to respond." Barbara looked like she had bitten into a lemon. "Fine. Mr. Caldwell, you have 5 minutes." I stood up. My hands were sweating, but I had practiced what I wanted to say. 6 months ago, I planted a vegetable garden in my fenced backyard. It wasn't visible from the street. It was neat, well-maintained, and gave me a lot of joy. On the morning of October 14th, I woke up to find Barbara Hendricks, Deborah Martinez, Richard Paulson, and 2 contractors on my property ripping out my garden. They destroyed months of work in less than an hour. I pulled out my phone and projected photos onto the wall using a portable projector I had brought. These are pictures of my garden before it was destroyed. As you can see, it was not overgrown or full of weeds as Barbara claimed. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Barbara told me that morning that the HOA had sent me 3 notices about the violation, which I never received. I went to the post office and got verification that no certified mail was sent to my address from the HOA. I held up the stamped statement from the post office. More murmurs, louder now. Furthermore, I have been informed by a member of this board that the notices were never actually mailed. They were created and backdated to create a false paper trail justifying the destruction of my property. Richard Paulson's face had gone pale. Barbara shot him a venomous look. This isn't about whether my garden violated the covenants. This is about a board that abuses its power, doesn't follow proper procedures, and treats homeowners with contempt. This is about accountability. I sat down. The room erupted in conversation. Barbara banged a gavel. That's enough. Mr. Caldwell's accusations are slanderous. We followed every procedure. Tom Harrison stood up. Barbara, I've lived here for 15 years. I've served on the board before, years ago. What you did to Marcus is not how this HOA is supposed to operate. We're supposed to be neighbors helping neighbors, not a police state. Several people applauded. A woman I didn't know stood up. I've been fined 3 times in the past year for trivial things. My house number being an inch off center, my mailbox being the wrong shade of black. This has gotten ridiculous. More people started speaking up, sharing their own stories of unreasonable fines and heavy-handed enforcement. Barbara tried to maintain control, but the room was turning against her. Finally, Patricia stood up. Madam President, I move that we proceed to the recall vote. Seconded, at least 5 people shouted. Barbara had no choice. Fine. The question before the membership is whether to recall the current board of directors. All those in favor of recall, raise your hands. A sea of hands went up. I tried to count but lost track. It was easily over 2/3 of the room. All opposed? Maybe 15 hands went up, mostly people who were friends with Barbara. The motion passes, Barbara said, her voice tight. The current board is recalled. She gathered her papers and walked out without another word. Deborah followed her. Richard stayed seated, looking relieved. Patricia took over the meeting. Pursuant to the recall, we need to elect a new board immediately. The following candidates have agreed to serve. She introduced each of the 5 candidates. We each gave a brief speech about our vision for the HOA. Then we held the election. It was a simple voice vote, and all 5 candidates were elected unanimously by those present. The meeting lasted another hour as we discussed immediate priorities. The first order of business was to review all the fines that had been issued in the past year and reverse any that were unreasonable. The second was to reimburse me for my destroyed garden and the fine I had been assessed. The third was to draft a clear policy about vegetable gardens, which would be permitted as long as they were maintained and not visible from the street. When I finally got home that night, it was after 10 o'clock. I was exhausted, but felt a sense of accomplishment I hadn't experienced in years. The next morning, I got a call from Jennifer Walsh. Marcus, I heard about the meeting. Congratulations. Thanks, I couldn't have done it without your advice. Listen, I got a call this morning from Barbara Hendrick's attorney. They want to settle. They're offering to reimburse you $2,000 for the garden destruction and the fine. Plus, they'll pay your legal fees to date. I haven't really incurred any legal fees yet. I'll bill for my consultation time. Call it $1,500. So $3,500 total. What do they want in return? They want you to agree not to pursue any legal action or file a police report regarding the false documentation. I thought about it. Part of me wanted to see Barbara face consequences for what she had done. But another part of me just wanted to move on and rebuild my garden. Let me think about it. I called Patricia and explained the offer. Take the settlement, she advised. You've already won. Barbara is off the board and humiliated. Pushing criminal charges would just drag this out and create more conflict in the neighborhood. She was right. I called Jennifer back. I'll take the settlement. The paperwork was drawn up and signed within a week. I received a check for $3,500. With that money, I bought new supplies and started rebuilding my garden. This time, several neighbors asked if I could help them start their own gardens. Tom Harrison wanted to grow tomatoes and peppers. Angela Voss wanted herbs. The Chens wanted to try growing Asian vegetables like bok choy and Chinese broccoli. The new HOA board held its first official meeting 2 weeks after the recall. We reviewed the covenants and identified several provisions that were outdated or overly restrictive. We drafted amendments that would be voted on at the annual meeting. We also implemented new procedures requiring board meetings to be properly noticed and open to homeowner attendance, with minutes posted online. One of the issues we tackled was the fine structure. Under Barbara's leadership, fines had been excessive and often imposed without proper notice or opportunity to cure violations. We implemented a new policy. First violation would be a courtesy notice with 2 weeks to fix it. Second violation would be a written warning with another 2 weeks, and only then would fines be imposed, starting at $50 rather than the hundreds Barbara had been charging. Richard Paulson ended up staying involved with the HOA, but not on the board. He volunteered to help with the finances as an advisor since he had institutional knowledge. He apologized to me privately for not standing up to Barbara sooner. "I should have said something when she told me not to mail those notices," he said. "I just didn't want to deal with the confrontation. I'm sorry." "I appreciate you telling the truth when it mattered," I replied. Barbara moved out of Riverside Meadows 3 months after the recall. I heard through the neighborhood gossip network that she had sold her house and bought a condo in Scottsdale. Deborah Martinez also left the board, but stayed in the neighborhood, keeping a much lower profile. Spring arrived and my rebuilt garden flourished. I had learned from the previous year's experience and had an even better setup with drip irrigation and better pest management. I grew more than my family could eat, so I started sharing with neighbors. We even had an informal harvest exchange where people would trade vegetables they grew. One Saturday in April, about 6 months after the recall, we held a neighborhood potluck in the community center. It was Patricia's idea, a way to build community and celebrate the changes. Over 80 people showed up. Tom Harrison made salsa from tomatoes and peppers he had grown. Angela brought a huge salad with herbs and lettuce from her garden. I made a ratatouille with zucchini, eggplant, tomatoes, and peppers from mine. During the potluck, Patricia stood up and made a short speech. "I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight. 6 months ago, our community was divided and people were afraid of their own HOA. Today, we're here together, sharing food and friendship. That's what a neighborhood should be. And we owe a lot of this to Marcus Caldwell, who had the courage to stand up when he was treated unfairly." People applauded, and I felt my face get hot. I wasn't comfortable being the center of attention. Tom leaned over and said quietly, "You did good, Marcus. You really did." The annual meeting was held in June. We voted on the covenant amendments, which passed easily. The most significant change was adding language explicitly allowing vegetable gardens, home composting, and other sustainable practices as long as they were maintained properly. We also added stronger procedural protections for homeowners, including mandatory notice requirements and the right to a hearing before fines could be imposed. During the meeting, Angela Voss suggested creating a community garden on the empty lot at the back of the subdivision. The lot was owned by the HOA, originally intended for a future expansion of the community center that had never happened. The idea was enthusiastically received. We formed a committee to plan it out, and by August, we had broken ground on a 1/4-acre community garden with raised beds available for any homeowner who wanted one. My own garden that year produced an incredible harvest. I canned tomatoes, made pickles from cucumbers, froze bags of peppers, and made pesto from the basil I grew. It was deeply satisfying. But more than that, it had given me something I didn't expect: a real sense of community. Before the incident with Barbara and the HOA, I had known my immediate neighbors but hadn't really connected with most people in Riverside Meadows. Now I knew dozens of people by name. I had friends I could call if I needed help. I had people who would stop and chat when we saw each other at the mailbox. One evening in September, almost a year after the garden had been torn out, I was working in my backyard when Tom Harrison came over with 2 beers. "Thought you might want a break," he said, handing me one. We sat on my deck, looking at the garden that had caused so much trouble and ultimately so much positive change. "You know what the ironic thing is?" Tom said. "Barbara thought she was protecting property values by enforcing all those rules. But I've talked to a realtor friend, and our property values are actually up compared to similar communities nearby. Turns out people like living in a neighborhood where the HOA isn't constantly harassing them. I laughed. Who would have thought? You ever think about running for the board yourself? No way. I've had enough drama to last a lifetime. Fair enough. But I'm glad you fought when you needed to. A lot of people would have just paid the fine and let it go. I couldn't. It wasn't about the money or even the garden, really. It was about the principle. Nobody should be able to march onto your property and destroy something you built just because they have a little bit of authority. Tom nodded. Well, you reminded everyone in this neighborhood that the HOA works for us, not the other way around. That's worth a lot. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset behind the houses across the way. My tomato plants were heavy with green fruit that would ripen in the next few weeks. The pepper plants were producing like crazy. The whole garden was thriving. The community garden had been a huge success too. Almost 30 families had signed up for plots, and the empty lot had been transformed into a beautiful space with paths, benches, and even a small shed for shared tools. People spent weekend mornings there, working on their plots and chatting with neighbors. It had become the heart of the community in a way the sterile HOA, manicured common areas, never had. In October, a local newspaper ran a story about the transformation of Riverside Meadows. The reporter interviewed me, Patricia, Tom, and several other homeowners. The article focused on how the community had gone from having one of the most restrictive and contentious HOAs in the Gilbert area to being a model of reasonable governance and community engagement. Other HOAs in the region reached out asking for advice. Patricia ended up writing a simple guide based on our experience, outlining best practices for HOA boards. The main points were straightforward. Remember, you're serving your neighbors, not ruling over them. Follow proper procedures always. Focus on genuine issues that affect property values and safety, not petty aesthetic preferences, and be transparent and accountable. One afternoon in November, I ran into Deborah Martinez at the grocery store. We hadn't spoken since the recall meeting. She looked uncomfortable when she saw me. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I should have stood up to Barbara. What she did to your garden was wrong, and I knew it at the time. I appreciate you saying that. For what it's worth, I'm glad how things turned out. The neighborhood is better now. I actually enjoy living here again instead of being stressed about every little thing." "That was the goal," I said. We talked for a few more minutes, and while I wouldn't say we became friends, there was at least peace between us. Barbara Hendricks, on the other hand, I never heard from again. I occasionally wondered if she learned anything from the experience or if she was causing problems in her new condo association. But mostly I didn't think about her at all. The holidays that year were different in Riverside Meadows. Instead of worrying about having decorations up exactly on time and down exactly when the HOA dictated, people decorated when they wanted and enjoyed the season. The new board made it clear that holiday decorations were welcome from November through early January, and after that we'd appreciate people taking them down within a reasonable time, but we weren't going to fine anyone for being a few days late. Patricia organized a neighborhood holiday party in mid-December. It was held in the community center, and over 100 people came. There was a gift exchange, cookies and hot chocolate, and Christmas music playing. It felt like what I had imagined when I first moved to Riverside Meadows, an actual community where people knew and cared about each other. As the new year rolled around, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. 15 months earlier, I had been living a quiet, isolated life in my subdivision, going to work, coming home, and not really connecting with anyone. The destruction of my garden had been devastating at the time, but it had also been a catalyst. I had learned that I was capable of standing up for myself and fighting back against injustice, even when it seemed easier to just accept it. I had learned that many people feel powerless in the face of authority, even petty authority like an HOA board, but that collective action could create real change. I had learned that my neighbors were good people who wanted the same things I did, to live peacefully, to be treated fairly, and to have a genuine sense of community. Most importantly, I had learned that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can lead to the best outcomes, as long as we're willing to stand up and work for something better. My vegetable garden thrived that second year even more than the first. I expanded it, adding a section for strawberries and another for melons. Tom's garden next door was doing great too, and we often worked in our yards at the same time, chatting over the fence. Angela had gotten really into herbs and was growing about 20 different varieties. The Chens had successfully grown amazing Asian vegetables and shared recipes with anyone interested. The community garden was full, with a waiting list for the next year. Patricia and the board decided to expand it, adding another dozen plots. We also added a children's section where families could teach their kids about gardening. In March, Arizona HOA magazine reached out to do a feature story on Riverside Meadows as an example of effective HOA reform. They interviewed the new board and several homeowners, and the article came out in May. The headline was, "From Conflict to Community: How One Arizona HOA Transformed Itself." The article detailed the recall, the changes we had made, and the improvements in community satisfaction and engagement. After the article was published, I got emails and phone calls from homeowners in other communities facing similar issues with overbearing HOA boards. I shared what had worked for us. Document everything, know your state laws regarding HOAs, build support among your neighbors, and focus on solutions rather than just complaints. Several other communities in the Gilbert and Phoenix area ended up going through their own recall processes, using our experience as a template. Not all of them were successful, but enough were that it started a real movement toward more reasonable HOA governance in the region. One evening in June, I was sitting on my back deck after a long day of work and gardening, drinking a cold beer and feeling the satisfaction of physical tiredness from a productive day. My phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. Hello? Mr. Caldwell, this is Detective Sarah Morrison with the Gilbert Police Department. I'm calling about a complaint filed regarding the Riverside Meadows HOA. My stomach dropped. Okay? We received a complaint from a former board member, Richard Paulson, regarding potential fraud and trespassing related to an incident last October. He provided documentation showing that false notices were created to justify entering your property and destroying your garden. Can you tell me about that? I explained the whole situation to the detective. I also mentioned that we had settled the matter and I had been reimbursed. I understand that, Mr. Caldwell, but creating false official documents and using them to justify trespassing onto private property is potentially a criminal matter, regardless of whether you were reimbursed in a civil settlement. I see. What happens now? We're investigating. I may need you to provide documentation and possibly give a formal statement. I just wanted to give you a heads up. After hanging up, I immediately called Richard Paulson. Richard, what's going on? A detective just called me. He sighed. Marcus, I'm sorry to drag you back into this, but my conscience has been bothering me for months. What Barbara did wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. She committed fraud by creating those fake notices. I was complicit because I didn't stop her. I talked to a lawyer, and he said I needed to report it to clear my own liability. Richard, we settled everything. I know, and I'm glad you got compensated. But this isn't just about you and Barbara. What if she does something like this in her new condo association? What if she creates fake documents to fine or sue someone else? Someone needs to hold her accountable. He had a point. As much as I wanted to be done with the whole situation, Barbara's actions had been genuinely illegal and could be repeated against other unsuspecting homeowners. All right, I'll cooperate with the investigation. Over the next few weeks, Detective Morrison interviewed multiple people, including me, Richard, several neighbors who had been present the day the garden was torn out, and even the contractors who had done the work. She subpoenaed the HOA's records, including the supposedly mailed notices. In August, almost 2 years after the garden incident, Barbara Hendricks was charged with fraud and criminal trespass. Deborah Martinez was charged as an accessory since she'd been present and participated in the board's actions, knowing the notices hadn't been sent. The case got media attention, being covered by local TV news stations as an example of HOA overreach. Barbara's lawyer tried to argue that it was a civil dispute, not a criminal matter, but the prosecutor maintained that creating false official documents to justify entering private property absolutely constituted criminal behavior. In October, Barbara pleaded guilty to reduced charges of attempted fraud and trespassing in exchange for avoiding jail time. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, ordered to pay a $2,000 fine to the state, and required to take an ethics course. Deborah pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge of trespassing and received 1 year of probation and 50 hours of community service. Richard Paulson, because he had come forward voluntarily and cooperated with the investigation, wasn't charged with any crime. He did resign from any involvement with the HOA, which was probably for the best. I wasn't sure how to feel about the outcome. Part of me thought Barbara deserved harsher punishment, but another part was just relieved the whole ordeal was truly over. That same October, 2 years after my garden had been destroyed, Riverside Meadows held its annual meeting. The community garden was thriving, the new governance policies were working well, and satisfaction among homeowners was at an all-time high according to a survey Patricia had conducted. During the meeting, Tom Harrison stood up and proposed something unexpected. I move that we create an annual award called the Good Neighbor Award, to be given each year to someone who exemplifies the values of community, fairness, and standing up for what's right. And I nominate Marcus Caldwell as the first recipient. The room burst into applause. I was completely taken by surprise. Patricia presented me with a plaque that read, Riverside Meadows Good Neighbor Award, presented to Marcus Caldwell for his courage, integrity, and dedication to creating a better community for all. I gave a short, impromptu speech, thanking everyone for their support and emphasizing that what we had accomplished was a collective effort, not the work of any one person. After the meeting, as people mingled over cookies and coffee, Angela came up to me. "You know what I realized?" she said. "Before all this happened, this was just a place where we lived. Now it's actually a community. People know each other, we help each other, we care about each other. That's worth more than any property value increase." She was absolutely right. As fall turned to winter and the year came to a close, I found myself in a place I never could have imagined 2 years earlier. What had started as a devastating violation and a moment of powerless rage had transformed into something positive and lasting. I had friends, a voice in my community, and gardens, both personal and communal, that brought joy to dozens of people. The vegetables were done for the season, and I had already started planning next year's garden. I was thinking about trying some different varieties of tomatoes, maybe some heirloom types. Tom wanted to try growing beans, and we were planning to put in a trellis system between our yards so we could grow pole beans together. On a clear December evening, I stood in my backyard looking at the empty garden beds that would lie dormant for the winter. In a few months, I'd start seeds indoors, preparing for another season of growth. The garden that Barbara had destroyed in a misguided attempt to enforce her vision of suburban perfection had been reborn as something much more significant. It wasn't just a vegetable garden anymore. It was a symbol of what happens when ordinary people stand up against unreasonable authority, when neighbors come together to demand fairness, and when a community decides that rules should serve the people, not control them. I thought about Barbara sometimes, wondering if she understood what she had really destroyed that October morning 2 years ago. It wasn't just tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers. She had destroyed the trust between the HOA and the homeowners, the illusion that her board was acting in the community's interest, and ultimately her own position and reputation. But from those ashes had grown something better, a real community based on mutual respect, reasonable governance, and genuine care for neighbors. My vegetable garden had been the catalyst, but the transformation had been everyone's work. As I headed back inside on that cold December evening, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The fight had been hard, and there had been moments when I doubted whether it was worth the stress and effort. But standing in my backyard, knowing that I had helped create lasting positive change, I knew absolutely that it had been worth it. The HOA tore out my vegetable garden and sent me a fine. And in response, I got every board member recalled, transformed our community, and helped spark a movement toward more reasonable HOA governance that spread throughout the region. Barbara Hendricks had tried to make an example of me to intimidate other homeowners into submission. Instead, I made an example of her board to show that homeowners have power when they stand together. That night, As I looked through seed catalogs planning next spring's garden, I smiled thinking about how far things had come. The garden Barbara destroyed had been about 20 by 15 feet. The community garden we built was now over a quarter acre and expanding. My personal garden plot had doubled in size, and most importantly, dozens of neighbors had started their own gardens, creating little pockets of green abundance throughout riverside meadows. Tomorrow I'd be meeting with Tom and Angela to finalize plans for the community garden expansion. Next week, Patricia wanted to discuss developing a neighborhood composting program. In the spring, we were planning a seed swap where gardeners could exchange seeds and seedlings. These were the kinds of activities an HOA should be facilitating, bringing people together, improving the community, creating value for homeowners beyond just enforcing rules. This was what I had fought for, and this was what we had achieved. As I finally closed the seed catalog and headed to bed, I thought about the journey from that awful October morning when I watched strangers destroy my garden to this peaceful December evening 2 years later. It had been exhausting, frustrating, sometimes scary, and ultimately rewarding in ways I never expected. I had learned that most people are reasonable and want the same things: to be treated fairly, to have a say in decisions that affect them, and to live in a community where neighbors care about each other. The problem is that institutions, even small ones like HOAs, can be taken over by people who abuse their power, and when that happens, it takes courage to stand up and fight back. But the fight is worth it. Because on the other side of that fight is the possibility of creating something better, not just fixing what was broken, but building something genuinely good. The HOA tore out my vegetable garden and sent me a fine. In the end, I got every board member recalled, helped establish new governance that respected homeowners' rights, saw the former president criminally charged for her fraudulent actions, and built a community that was stronger, kinder, and more connected than it had ever been before. And next spring, my garden would grow again, bigger and better than ever.